Hey everyone, this is Hallie Warner, Chief of Staff at Adam Hergenrother Companies. As you know, I am fascinated by how founders and leaders work together with their right-hand partners to turn ideas into action and build wildly successful businesses. I've worked alongside a multi-passionate visionary for over 11 years, growing multiple thriving companies along the way. We actually wrote a book about our strategic partnership called The Founder and the Force Multiplier, which you can find on Amazon. Today, I want to bring you some founder wisdom from none other than David Hauser. He's the founder of many companies and projects, including Grasshopper and Chargeify. He's also a founding member of National Entrepreneurs Day and is an angel investor in companies such as Unbounce, Grove, The Hustle, and over 50 more. He's also the author of Unstoppable: 4 Steps to Transform Your Life. You can learn more about David and his work at davidhauser.com. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more tips for founders and force multipliers. Just hit the subscribe button below and let us know what you think of this interview by leaving us a comment. Thanks for watching. All right, David, thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to do a quick start question. What are your 3 must-have apps?
Must-have apps. This is a hard one because I hate all apps. So
I'm kind of with you on that.
Email for sure, and I prefer Outlook because I think it just is so much better for calendaring an email than Gmail. I would say Asana. That's the only place I manage any tasks outside of, and like that's really the only app I use. I'm trying to think of a third one. I don't know, honestly. Like those are probably the apps I spend most of my time in, outside of like, Chrome or something like that, but like a functional application.
Yeah, you're not sitting scrolling through Instagram at night.
I deleted that a long time ago off my phone. I wish that the other day when it all went down that it all disappeared.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like I'm like, my life actually didn't really change that much while that was down. So
yeah, I bet there was a little more productivity for a few hours.
Might have been, yeah. So for those who are listening who aren't really familiar with you and your story, can you share a little bit about your history in the whole startup world? I know you've done a lot in that. And then what are you working on now?
Yeah, so I've been really lucky and built a lot of different companies. The biggest one was Grasshopper. So we built Grasshopper from 0 to $30 million a year in revenue and sold it to Citrix 12 years in. So an overnight success. Built and sold Chargeify. Worked on a bunch of other SaaS applications and companies. Probably made about 100 angel investments. Today, we buy companies specifically in the direct-to-consumer space. So most recently, we bought Perfect Keto, the largest direct-to-consumer brand. We're continuing to buy, brands doing, more than $5 million a year, EBITDA positive, and a real direct-to-consumer presence. And we still own a number of other SaaS businesses or service businesses. And then I also write a weekly email that I send out every week on Thursdays. So this morning, that one went out. And I've had a lot of fun doing that.
Yes, we read your email religiously. So what did you do before you started was Grasshopper Hopper the first business that you started?
No, it was really the first one that became meaningful in terms of size and scale and number of employees and things like that. I had done a lot of other things before that. Like I had a web design company. I did a lot of other stuff, right? I actually did start an internet company in New York with a bunch of partners, but I left very early on. So it's hard for me to say like, I experienced the scaling stage there. I experienced the very early startup stage there, right? That company became very successful, but I went to college. So I would say Grasshopper was really the first one where I was responsible for the scaling.
Have you ever worked in a traditional role, traditional job, or have you always been in an entrepreneurial role?
No, I think the only thing I ever did is I worked at a friend's company for a few months before we started a company together. He was much older than me, and he was in the New York internet scene. And it was a way for me to get in. I was in high school. So I quote unquote worked there for a few months, but I didn't last very long.
Okay, so what is it about either you or your goals or what you want that just drove you to jump right into entrepreneurship?
I always knew that I was going to be an entrepreneur, and I think there was two reasons. One is I wanted to prove to people I could be successful. In school, I struggled for years with grades, a learning disability, reading, writing, a number of different things. So I just wanted to prove to people I could be successful. And that's what it still drives me today, right? Like that drive. The other piece of it is I was lucky enough to go to schools that kind of ingrained or allowed me to pick entrepreneurship as a journey, right? And I didn't have to be great at school, but I could succeed at something. And I think that built the kind of the acceptableness to say, okay, this is a path I want to take, which allowed me to make that decision pretty early.
Yeah, really cool. When did so you got into delegated a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
That organization. What prompted you to get into the assistant business? And what have you learned so far?
Yeah, so it's always been an industry that's interested me a lot. Like I've had different assistants over the years in different capacities, both in person in the office, virtual. I actually now much prefer having a virtual assistant than someone in my office. And we can talk about why that is, but that's what I've kind of come to prefer now. And when we looked at the company, it was originally Red Butler. We bought it, we rebranded it, made a lot of changes internally and externally. I think it's a really interesting industry because there's lots of people that provide really cheap overseas assistance, which I think sets people up for failure. Like I don't encourage that, right? Like I know there's a big group of people who talk about why that's great or whatever to pay someone $400 a month for full-time work. Like I don't think you get very much out of that. And it was hard to find quality people on a part-time basis that had training and all of the things that were important where I didn't have to train people. So I knew there was a gap in the market, right? And that's why I got involved with Delegated. And I think that's what we do really well is the higher end of that market, right? So not like 5 hours, 10 hours a month, like 40 hours a month, right? Like that type of capacity, which is more like what I consider typical part-time, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And then of course we scale all the way up to full-time as well.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that if you do full-time as well.
Yeah.
I'm very curious to know why you prefer virtual.
So, I mean, I've run virtual companies for quite a while now, and I think that there's an aspect of being all in on that makes a lot of sense, right? Like if I'm going to have my team be virtual, doesn't really make sense to have someone in my office, right? I think the other piece of it is it has required me to think about much more meaningful tasks than what people typically think about, which is like, oh, my car needs to be serviced. Oh, like all the physical things that actually can be outsourced quite well by someone who knows what they're doing virtually, right? Like TaskRabbit or 100 other ways to do things, right? Also, it doesn't matter where I am, right? So if I'm traveling for 2 months, my process and schedule and all the things that happen, there's no change, right? Because we're not typical or leaning back on an office or in-person connection, right? So for me, it's been really valuable.
When you do need those in-person things done, is your assistant handling the coordination of those, or do you do that?
Yeah, so all that coordination is handled by my assistant, right? So if that's vendors coming to the house, if that's things like that, right? And obviously there's little hiccups in there, like, well, someone needed to be at the house or something happened, right? Like that happens, right? But for me, it's much more about like, okay, look, you understand my schedule. So that means if I need to be at my house, schedule 3 vendors all on the same day after 4 p.m., right? Yeah. And then that means my day is shortened by an hour or 2, right? In office time. I get home at 4 instead of 6. And that gets all accomplished very efficiently. So I've never found a problem with that.
Yeah. When did you hire your first assistant? At what point in your entrepreneurial journey did you make that hire, and how did it go?
It was quite a while ago at Grasshopper, and it was actually a gentleman named Andy, who we couldn't find a role for in the organization. And I'm like, okay, I need a bunch of these in-person physical tasks done. So I'm like, I'm just gonna hire him and have him do it. And that was kind of like my way of not giving up control of the things that I should have done, which was calendar, meetings, all of the valuable things that I didn't want to feel I was losing control of. I was scared, right? So I just leaned on it initially, like, oh, just let him do those things, right? The in-person stuff. So I'd say it was reasonably successful, right? Like I got back some of my time, right? There was an ease in certain things, but it wasn't high value, right? I saved a few hours here or there compared to actually being able to use my time more effectively and efficiently during that period.
How long was Andy with you in that role?
4 years, probably.
Oh, wow. Okay. Did he ever end up taking on any additional responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, he took on some stuff, a lot of travel related things. So like I trained him on like, how do I care about travel booking and things like that? Because I was traveling a lot. So logistically, that did help me take more time, but it took me years and years to give up calendar. Like I only gave up my calendar 3 years ago, right? And Andy stopped working for me 6-7 years ago. So I mean,
what was the hesitation there?
I'm trying to remember exactly when it was.
Yeah.
Or what was the hesitation with calendar?
Calendar, yeah. Why did you want to give it up?
I think there was two things. One, I wasn't willing to put in the time to document my preferences. So it felt easier to just do it myself.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I block off these times in the mornings, but it wasn't blocked off my calendar. So like all of those little nuances, I like a break between meetings, or I have a gap from work, or whatever it is, rather than managing it on my calendar the right way, I was managing it in my head. So like, I think of that as all documentation of preferences, how I want things to happen. Like even down to like how I have scheduled, like subjects of invites, right? Like I want them in a certain format, in a certain way, but I didn't document it. I just did it myself, right? The other part I think is very much control related, which is, having someone else make decisions about when something goes on a calendar, and in what order, or what priority, or where someone goes. Should I move something for this person or not that person? Felt like giving up a lot of control. And for me, I just had to jump in. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it. We're going to make some mistakes the first month, and then we'll quickly learn together, what my priorities are and why, and then document them.
Was there a tipping point where you were like, I just need to give this up? Was there anything that, any catalyst in your business or home life that made you need to do that?
I felt like a lot of stress when I would get into the office and see a bunch of emails that were all scheduling related. And it felt like a lot of weight that was useless. Like I'd look at them like, there's like 15 emails here. They're all scheduling, right? And I'm not focusing on the important things because I want to get these out of the way. So I start sending options for meetings and all these different things. Like that felt really wasteful, like every morning when I got that big set of emails.
Yeah, when you don't have an assistant, you are the assistant.
Yeah.
So now you've like how does that relationship look now in your life with your assistant?
Yeah, so my calendar is 100% controlled by my assistant, outside of things that I book, right? So I have both, weekly things that I book for like work or schedules. Like I try to book a lot of things, even like listening to audiobooks, right? Like I put that on my calendar. So I've become very, very regimented in the things I put there. And it's helped me a lot too. Like when I travel, I pre-book that way in advance. I always was pretty, schedule heavy. Like I thought about those things, but now I put a lot more details that are helpful. Like I'm on a flight in this time period. So it's not just me knowing that, right? And there's a whole deeper level to my whole travel bookings. But so that's all meetings then go through my assistant, right? If there's any question, we've also taken a process which is just much more one-off, because most of my meetings are pretty standard, compared to like lots of random things coming up, where if I had that, I'd probably have either a daily or a weekly call to discuss those. Now we just take it on a one-off basis. Like, hey, David, is this a really important one? Should I move someone or not, or whatever? But I can process through those very quickly.
What has having an assistant in your life, like what has it allowed you to focus on? Are there, 2 or 3 main things that you are really now able to devote your time to?
Yeah, so I put it in a few buckets. Like the first bucket for me is like all of my home stuff is like taken care of, meaning like vendors, things getting fixed, like stuff that I would have just not done, right? And so I feel better about it, right? So like that to me is less about like, how did I do more things? It's what would I have not done that is now being done and makes me feel good, right? Like the pool getting fixed or whatever, that would have taken 3 months because I would have ignored it and it wouldn't have been a priority. Now it happens, right? So I like that set of things. the other set, obviously, taking away inbox time has been very important, not just scheduling wise, but inbox in total, because there's less things that come to me, right? If that's invoices, if that's other things that can be taken off my plate, if it's less in my inbox, that gives me back a lot of time, because I spend a lot of time in email. And I actually think email is tremendously productive when managed well, right? So I'm not one of those people like, I only do email once a day. No, like I can be very productive with email, and I'm in it all day long.
Like, what are you spend? I mean, you spend your time in your email. Are you doing any more writing? Like, where are you kind of focusing your time right now?
Yeah. So email allows me to operate a lot within a bunch of different companies, because I can context switch. I can talk to a lot of different people. I try to keep very regimented calendars and meetings. So daily meetings, weekly meetings, monthly meetings, across executive teams, across teams within a company, things like that. So my time is then structured and cuts down on a lot of the interruptions, because everyone knows that we're having a weekly meeting. So we create an agenda for it, and it happens at that period, right? Or a daily meeting or whatever it is, right? My time is spent, I think, I would say a combination of email. So that's communicating with external parties, internal, which is like research, reading, consumption of high quality content, which then comes out in my emails and other stuff, right? So like that's kind of a path through there. And then the rest is concentrated meeting time. So like gaps of time where I say, this is when I do meetings. And then there's the personal side of it, which is like my morning is very structured outside of work, right? So I drop my kids off at school in the morning. Like that's important to me. I go to the gym every morning. I practice yoga. I lift weights. Like I get ready at the gym. Even on days when I might not have time, which is very rare, but like, I'm traveling and I don't have time to work out, I still get ready at the gym, right? So like part of that routine, but that's all structured and scheduled on the calendar.
Yeah, that's awesome. What time do you get up in the morning? Are you like the 4 a.m. riser?
No, I mean, I get up at like 5:30 or so.
Okay, that's still early.
But in fairness, I also go to bed at like 9:30. So
yeah.
It's not that early.
That's true. Yeah, Adam is in bed usually like around 8:30. I'm like, awesome.
I wish. There's just too much stuff happening in the house. Like,
yeah,
it's just not
I'm
possible.
sure. Yeah. What does that communication structure look like specifically with your assistant? It sounds like you've got those regular cadences of meetings. Where does your assistant fit into that in your communication?
Yeah, so I try to keep that very focused in a few areas. So things that are task or project based are in Asana, right? So that there's threaded communications about a task that can be defined clearly by me or by her, has a due date, has processes, like things happening, right? One-off questions that are important are text message. I prefer that way over phone calls, because I can be much more efficient. Like obviously not on a podcast, but like on a Zoom meeting, I could get a text message, respond, and progress someone forward when it's urgent, which I don't like Slack. I like text messages for that. And then email for things that have external factors, like a vendor emailed me, and it's much easier to forward that email than create a task, right? So those are the three main buckets. We rarely talk on the phone. Like my last assistant, Catherine, I think we talked on the phone in a 2-year period 5 times.
Yeah. Yeah, Adam and I worked together now for 11 years as of yesterday, and the amount of times we've talked on the phone is like maybe 10.
Yeah.
Take us back to the very early days of some of your entrepreneurial ventures. What are some of the big mistakes that you made that you want to share? And maybe 1 or 2. And what did you learn from them, and what can people take away if they're just starting out on their own?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake we made starting out was we didn't focus on core values, core purpose, and voicing those and talking about them. So like we knew them inherently for ourselves, me and my business partner, but we didn't integrate it into hiring. We didn't put them up. We didn't even talk about it. We didn't have words around it. We just knew and felt them, right? And that caused a lot of problems. Wrong hiring, wrong people, and unfortunately, it was all hidden by growth, right? And I say unfortunately because like we got through 4 years of lots of growth doing the wrong things, right? And the growth hides all that stuff, right? And honestly, I think if we hadn't found that, when we started to struggle or hit plateaus, we never would have overcome them, right? Because we didn't have then the capacity to do it. So I'm glad that we focused when we did. So one, core values, core purpose. Two, I think not realizing early enough the difference between stages within the company and the types of people I needed around me, right? So when we were starting, it was a lot of doers, right? Like I would say, hey, go do this, come back to me. Hey, go do this, come back to me, right? As we continued to grow, I needed to give up both, control, but also I needed a different set of people around me that were more thinkers than doers, right? And could say strategically, David, here's what I'm going to do and why, right? Compared to me just assigning tasks out, right? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs get stuck in this stage where they're trying to grow, but all they're doing is assigning tasks.
Right? How did you get out of that? Was it just one hire? Was it a cultural shift in the company?
I think it was a realization that I did not want to be in all of those things and a people manager. Like that was the driving factor. Like I'm not great at people management. Like I can do okay in one-on-ones and the process and career pathing. And like, I understand it. And I actually think it's super important. I'm just not the greatest at it, right? Like there are people far better than me. So when I said, okay, like I need to move myself out of that, that required a different set of people. We then started to see it in very specific expertise areas, right? If it was marketing or if it was operations, where we would outgrow someone, right? And there was this fear of like, well, we should just keep them because they've been good for the previous stage. And as entrepreneurs, we had to realize, no, we need to find the best person for the stage today in this seat, right? Mm-hmm. And that was a hard realization. I think it just happened over time.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how many years in did you think that switch, that you made that switch?
5 years in.
Yeah.
It just takes time to realize, I think.
I think so too. Yeah, we've definitely been there. What books have had the biggest impact on your personal and professional life?
So I actually have a book list on my website that I draw a lot of stuff from. I would say I loved Sapiens, unrelated to business, obviously, but I think just kind of thought process along those paths, The Evolution of Everything. Similarly, like just pointing to the fact, like we're in a better place than we were 10 years ago, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, and like how everything evolves, even though we think there's problems, right? And so I really enjoyed that. On the business side of things, I think there's like obvious choices like Good to Great and such, like talk about, core values and BHAG and all of those things. I think that's helpful. But when I think about from a personal perspective, I would say Atomic Habits helped me crystallize a lot of things I already felt, but hadn't put words around. So I think that was a good one. There's probably a few others that stand out, but I have a list on my website.
Yeah, we'll definitely add that to the show notes. Thank you. A lot of people have really great business ideas, but they don't know what the first step is. So what would you recommend they do as a first step for those listening?
Yeah, so I get asked this all the time, and my advice is actually quite simple. It's take any step forward, right? Because I think where most people fail is in this planning stage. They just plan forever, right? And I think no matter what that first step is, if it's calling a prospective customer, if it's talking to, the person who might be able to help develop the app, if it's, whatever that step is, right? It's one step beyond talking or writing about it, right? Yeah. Like it's an action step. And I think as you start to add those up, right, much like Atomic Habits, right, like you just add up these little pieces, and then all of a sudden, a month later, 6 months later, you're tremendously further than you ever thought.
Yeah, I love that. You're right. It builds the momentum, and you never know really what opportunity may arise by just taking those steps.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Anything else that you want to share that I didn't ask about?
No, I mean, I would say that I have some different views on a lot of tools. Like I don't use a lot of apps. I hate Slack. I think it destroys companies. I hope that a lot of these things go away. And then also email. I think people make the mistake of jumping on the bandwagon of like email's a distraction and like these silly statements. because they're using it incorrectly. I
Mm.
think if you're getting to inbox zero, you're managing tasks properly, and you have a system and process around things, email is actually the most productive possible application of communication that exists, right? Like, period. It's better than Zoom. It's better than, like, obviously there are conversations that must happen on Zoom, but in terms of pure productivity, email wins out every time.
Yeah, agree. I'm a huge fan of email. Why is Slack destroying companies?
So
What are
I
those
think
types of apps?
I think it becomes a burden more than anything, right? So one, companies don't properly voice the expectation of communications of what should go on what channels. Like, asynchronous communication should end up in email. Things that require multiple parties to collaborate should be on Zoom. Things that are instant actual need right now should be in some sort of real-time messaging. If that happens to be text message or Slack, I don't think it really matters.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when people are like, I've replaced email with Slack, right? Like, you are asking for trouble, because as the company grows, now you have this like weight hanging over everyone. Like, did I miss something in Slack? Is it really important? Now I got to go back and look at it. There's 400 channels. Which ones do I look at and why? And there's no context or importance or anything happening. So I get in the morning, and as an owner or founder, it's easy to ignore stuff, right? Because there's not a lot of, blowback, right? If you're an employee, or you feel like you must catch up on all of that, so you waste 2 hours in the morning catching up on Slack messages, right?
Yeah.
And I think that only gets worse with scale. It doesn't get better.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I actually tend to agree. We use very similar communication methods at our company that you just mentioned, and couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just about setting expectations, right? Like, hey, our culture is, this is what ends up in email and why, and we expect emails to be responded to by the end of the day at the latest, but preferably 2 hours, or like whatever those expectations are, communicate them.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, you're very clear, and you set the set expectations.
Yeah.
Where can our listeners connect with you to learn more about you, your work?
Yeah, davidhauser.com has links to everything, book list, weekly email, all of those things are there, as well as my contact information. Happy to talk to people. And you obviously mentioned Delegated, delegated.com. I try not to promote the service necessarily, but it is one that I do believe in. My assistant works there, so she has taken all of the training and stuff that I've built and started to take that across the organization. So my playbooks and all of that are used within that organization for other clients now. So how we document things and make that transition across assistants really easy.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's the one thing that I think, maybe not the one thing, but one of the great things I think Delegated has that differentiates it is the training part. And how all of the EAs and assistants are trained with the playbooks, which I think is amazing.
And we don't allow people to have forward-facing clients until they've trained under an assistant, doing back-end work and seeing the playbooks and all the things that happen first, right? So no matter the kind of experience level they come in at, they have to go through that to see what systems do we care about, how do we communicate, all of that stuff. So when they move into a client-facing role, they have all of that experience, right?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me for a little bit, David. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.